In Comprehensive 7-1 of your assignments, we're preparing the tax return for Bryce and Kaylee Young. Both are under age 65 and they will file married filing jointly. They have one child who is 6 years old. Both of them have a Form W-2. Bryce made a $500 contribution to an IRA because he doesn't have a retirement plan at work. And they also have some interest reported on Form 1099 INT. Kaylee had some overtime separately reported in the amount of $468. So we're going to be completing Schedule 1A to calculate her additional deduction for that overtime. Jazzy, their daughter, stays at a daycare for which they have a letter telling how much they spent on the daycare for the year. Basically, it's going to have all the information we need to complete Form 2441. So let's get started with the 1040. I've completed the top portion, the names with the Social Security numbers, and they're going to file married filing jointly. They've both lived in the U.S. for more than half the year, and they did not dispose of any digital assets. They do have the dependent, Jazzy. We have her name and her Social Security number and her relationship. She did live with the couple for more than half of 2025, and they lived in the U.S. She is under age 17, so Kaylee and Bryce will qualify for the child tax credit of $2,200. So as always, we're going to start with our earned income to enter here in box 1. So the instructions are going to provide that information for us. We'll go to the W-2. And we see here that Bryce has earned $30,500. And then Kaylee earned $28,500. That gives them a total earned income of $59,000. So let's get that on the 1040. And we'll go ahead and just bring this down to line 1Z to total up because there's no more earned income. They did have a 1099 INT that reported $88.61 or $89. So we'll go and enter that on line 2B. Since the amount is less than $1,500, we're not going to have to do a Schedule B. So our next step is just to total the income down on line 9. So it's the $59,000 plus the $89 will give us $59,089. That's going to take care of all of their income. Now we can start working on the adjustments to income on Schedule 1. It said that Bryce made a $500 contribution to his IRA. So we can go over to Schedule 1. Remember, page 1 of Schedule 1 reports additional income, and there's not any to report. So we're going to go on to page 2 and report the adjustments to income. And the IRA deduction is a 4 AGI deduction. So that just means that you're going to use that figure to get to your adjusted gross income. And on line 20, we'll enter the $500 deduction. So that's all of our Schedule 1 deductions. We'll bring that figure down to line 26. And we're told to enter that figure on line 10 of the 1040. So we'll go over and enter the 500 on line 10, and we can then calculate the adjusted gross income, which will come out to $58,589. 11A is going to just carry right over to 11B. Line 12 is for the standard deduction. We know that no one can claim either of our taxpayers as dependents, and neither spouse itemized on a separate return. They were not dual status aliens, and they were not born before 1961, nor were they blind. So we're not going to mark any of those. We're just going to find the standard deduction amount for someone or taxpayers filing jointly, and that's $31,500. Next, we know that Kaylee had overtime, which is not taxable this year. So we're going to go to Schedule 1A to calculate her additional deduction. We have the taxpayer's name at the top, and in Part 1, we're going to enter the modified adjusted gross income from the couple. And if we go back to the 1040, we'll see that the adjusted gross income is $58,589. Now, this is entered because some of these deductions are phased out based on your income, but they should be okay at their income level. We're going to go down to Part 3, the no tax on overtime, and on 14A, we're going to enter the qualified overtime compensation. The instructions told us that she earned $468 in qualified overtime compensation, so we'll bring that down to line 14C. Line 15 says enter the smaller of the amount on 14C, or $12,500, $25,000 if married filing jointly. So that will just be the $468. We're going to enter the amount from line 3, which was simply the modified adjusted gross income. So on 16, we'll put the $58,589. 17 says to enter $300,000 if married filing jointly. And then we're going to subtract line 17 from 16. Well, we cannot subtract $300,000 from $58,589. The figure's too big. So we're going to enter 0 because we would get a negative number if we subtracted $300,000 from $58,589. Line 19 says to divide line 18 by 1,000. There's nothing to divide there. And then we're going to multiply line 19 by 100. Still get 0. So the qualified overtime compensation deduction is, we're going to subtract line 20 from line 15. So that'll give us the $468. And we'll complete the form. The no tax on car loan interest doesn't apply. The enhanced deduction for seniors does not apply. They're under 65. So we'll bring down our total deduction of $468 to line 38. We're going to carry this over to line 13B of the 1040. And then on line 14, we're going to add lines 12E, 13A, and 13B to get our total deduction of $31,968. On line 15, we're going to get our taxable income by subtracting the adjusted gross income and the total adjustments on line 14. So when we do that, we get a taxable income of $26,621. This is the figure we're going to use to calculate our tax. Okay, so we finally come to the tax liability line. So we're going to go over to our tax tables that are provided in the problem, and we're going to find the range where the 26,621 falls. And that's right here between the 26,600 and the 26,650. Now we need to come to the correct column. This is the married filing jointly column. That's where we need to be. So the tax on the 26,621 is $2,718. So I'll enter the 2718 here on line 16. We don't have any additional taxes from Schedule 2, so we'll bring the 2718 down to line 18. And now we can start on our tax credits. Remember, tax credits are a dollar for dollar reduction in your tax liability. So the first one we're going to start with is the child and dependent care expenses on Form 2441. On the form, I have the taxpayer's information at the top. Question A asks if the couple meets a special requirement for filing separately. That doesn't apply. They're filing jointly, so we're going to leave that check mark blank. On B, it asks if one of the spouses was a full-time student or was disabled during 2025. If one spouse is a full-time student or was disabled and has no income, they would be assigned or deemed income that could be entered so that the credit could be taken. Both spouses are working and have enough income to cover the dependent care expenses, so we don't need to check box B either. They did not have more than 3 caregivers that they're asked here in Part 1, so we don't have to check that box. Next is the information that we're getting from the letter in the instructions. So if we go over to the letter from Kitty Care, we have their address, their employer ID number, and also the name of the child being cared for, the amount that was collected from the taxpayers, and then for the dates of the services. So we have the name, the address, the tax ID number. This asks if was the care provider your household employee. Now we're going to mark no. If someone did come into the house to care for your child, that person would be considered an employee, and you would have to pay employer taxes on that person, just like we paid employer taxes on Schedule H in the last chapter. So we're definitely marking no there. And then here we're going to enter the amount paid, which was the $3,700. We did not, or the taxpayers did not receive dependent care benefits from their employer, so we'll say no and then go down to Part 2. In Part 2, we're going to enter the dependent's information, the dependent's name, social security number, and then we're going to check if the child was over 12 and disabled, and that's not the case here. And then we're going to enter all the qualifying expenses. On line 3, we're going to add the amounts in column D, but notice it says don't enter more than $3,000 if you had one qualifying person, or $6,000 if you had 2. So $6,000 is the maximum if you have 2 or more dependents. For just one, the maximum amount you can enter is $3,000. On line 4, you have to enter your earned income, and that's talking about taxpayer 1, which would be Bryce, and his W-2 said he earned $30,500. Remember, each taxpayer has got to have enough income to at least cover the amount of qualified expenses, because the IRS doesn't want somebody who doesn't work taking a child care deduction when they could be caring for the child at home. On line 5, it says, if married filing jointly, enter the spouse's earned income. So we have, if we go back over to the W-2 and look at Kaylee's W-2, she had $28,500 in earned income. Line 6 says enter the smaller of 3, 4, or 5. So we're going to enter the 3,000. Line 7 wants the amount of adjusted gross income from line 11A. So if we went back to the 1040 and looked at line 11A, we would have $58,589. On line 8, we're going to use the amount on line 7 to figure the decimal amount to apply to our dependent care payments. And so since their adjusted gross income is greater than $43,000, the decimal amount will be 0.20. So the point is there, we're just going to enter 20. And on line 9A, we're going to multiply line 6 times the decimal to get our credit. Okay, line 9B doesn't apply, so if we add 9A and B, we'll get the 600 credit there. On 10, it's asking for the tax liability limit. The credit for dependent care is not refunding. So the IRS wants to make sure that there's enough tax liability that will cover the $600 credit. In other words, the couple has got to have more tax liability than $600. And if we go back to their return, you'll see that their tax liability was $2,718. So that figure is much higher than this credit that they're getting. We could use the credit limit worksheet, but since it's the first credit we're working with, we'll just go ahead and enter their tax liability here. And then on the 11, we're going to enter the smaller of 9C or line 10. So that's the 600. Then we'll take the 600 and carry it on over to Schedule 3, line 2. Okay, and I've already got that in there. So on line 2, there is our credit for child and dependent care expenses. The next credit we'll look at is the credit for qualified retirement savings contributions. If you remember, Bryce made a $500 deposit into an individual retirement account. We've already taken a 4 AGI deduction for the taxpayers, and now there's also this credit available, and we're going to report that on Form 8880. We'll just start at the top of the form with the taxpayer's name and social. The first little bullet point here says that you cannot take this credit if you are married filing jointly and earn over $79,000. Well, we know that the couple's adjusted gross income is $58,585 or something like that. And then the next bullet says you can't take this credit if you were born after 2008, which means you're under 17, or can be claimed as a dependent, and neither one of those apply. So we have number 1, a traditional and Roth IRA contributions. So we are going to enter the $500 on line 1. There are no deferrals, so we'll bring that down to line 3. Okay, On line 4, line 4 does not apply, so we'll just bring the 500 on down to line 5. And then on line 6, it says enter the smaller of line 5 or 2,000. 2,000 is the maximum that you can contribute to get this credit. So they're at 500, so they're well under that figure. Line 7 says enter the amount on line 6. So we'll just bring the 500 on down. Line 8 wants the couple's adjusted gross income from the 1040 on line 11A. So that's the $58,589. And then we're going to figure out our decimal to apply to the $500 payment. Their adjusted gross income falls between $51,000 and $59,250. So for married filing jointly taxpayers, the decimal is 0.1. Line 10 says to multiply line 7 times line 9, and that will give us $50. And now we need to go over and look at our credit limit worksheet. The purpose of the credit limit worksheet is to make sure that we do not take more in credits than we have in tax liability. So on line 1, we're asked to enter the tax liability from the 1040 line 18, and that was the 2718. And then on number 2, we're given a series of credits to enter the amount that we have already taken in these credits. Well, we've only taken the child and dependent care credit for $600. So I will total that here on the total non-refundable credits line. And then when we subtract the $600 from the $2718, we'll get $2,118. So that'll be the maximum that we can take on Form 8880. So on 11, our limit is the 2118. And for 12, we're going to enter the smaller of 10 or 11, which will be the $50, and we're to enter it on Schedule 3, line 4. So we'll go over to Schedule 3 and down to line 4 and enter our $50 credit. This is the final credit to be entered on Schedule 3. So we'll bring our total credits down to line 8, totaling $650, and then we will take this $650 over to line 20 on the 1040. Line 20, and we'll enter the $650. We've got one last credit, and that is the child credit, and we're going to complete Schedule 8812 to determine our child credit for 2025. Line 1 says enter the amount from line 11A, Form 1040. Well, that is the adjusted gross income that we've entered so many times already. That's a very important number. So many other credits and deductions are based on this figure, so it's really important that it's accurate. There's no income from Puerto Rico, Form 2555 or 4563. So we'll just bring the adjusted gross income down to $58,589. Then here on line 4, we're going to enter the number of qualifying children under age 17. Okay, and of course to take the deduction, the child has to have a Social Security number. We're going to multiply this 1 times the 2200 to get our potential credit of 2200. Okay, there are no other dependents that we can list, so we will skip line 6 and line 7. That's for other dependents. And then on line 8, we're going to add lines 5 and 7, which is empty, and we'll get the 2,200. On line 9, it says enter the amount shown for your filing status, and we're married filing jointly, so we'll enter the 400,000. Line 10 says that to subtract line 9 from line 3, and line 9 is too big to subtract from line 3. You'd get a negative number, so if 0 or less, enter 0. And then on 11, we're going to multiply 5% times line 10, which will give us 0. And then on line 12 is the amount on line 8 more than the amount on line 11. So, yes. So we can subtract 11 from 8. 11 is 0, line 8 is 2,200, so 2,200 is the difference. Now we've got to go to another credit limit worksheet to determine how much tax liability we have remaining for this child tax credit. Here is the credit limit worksheet A that you'll use for your 8812. It will be provided with your Chapter 7 exam. You can see that I could not find one that could be filled out on the computer, so you can print it and fill it out by hand. You don't have to turn it in, but it's just going to help you figure out how much tax liability is remaining for this credit. And it works just like the other worksheet that we did. We have to enter the amount from line 18, form 1040. And that is our tax liability of $27.18. And then we're going to enter all the other credits we've already taken, and it's referring to Schedule 3. So if we go back to Schedule 3, we have got a $600 credit for the child independent care, and then the $50 credit for the retirement savings. That's on line 2 and 4. So we've entered the 600 and the 50 for a total of 650. If we subtract the 650 from the 2718, we have $2,068 remaining in tax liability. So we don't have to complete Part B of the worksheet, so we'll just put 0 here. And then if we subtract that 0 from line 3, we're going to get $2,068. So on our 8812, that's going to be our maximum credit. So even though they were eligible for the 2,200, they've already gotten some other credits, and they're only left with $2,068 of tax liability to offset. So if we enter for line 14, the higher of line, or the lower of line 12 or 13, we're going to enter 13 at the 2,068, and we're going to carry that over to the 1040 line 19. Okay, so 2,068. Now we can get finished up with this 1040. On line 21, we're asked to add lines 19 and 20. That gives us 2718. On line 22, it says to subtract line 21 from line 18. And 2718 from 2718 is 0. On 23, there are no additional taxes we have to pay. So the total tax owed is line 22 plus 23, or 0. So their tax credits have lowered their tax liability all the way down to 0. Now they've had some W-2 income, so we know they have prepaid some of their taxes. So if we go back over to the W-2s, Bryce got $1,000 withheld in income tax, and Kaylee got $1,000 withheld. So they had a total of $2,000 withheld in prepayments. That's going to be all the prepayments, so we'll bring that figure down to 25D. There were no estimated tax payments. The earned income credit does not apply here, but we need to take a look at line 28, the additional child tax credit, and that is also on Schedule 8812, Part 2. So let's go back to the 8812 and go down to the second page. It says to subtract line 14 from line 12 if zeros stop here. So if we take 14 and subtract that from line 12, we're going to get $132. So we'll enter 132 on 16A. On 16B, the number of qualifying children under age 17 with the required Social Security number, that's 1. And we'll multiply that times 1,700. Enter the result if zeros stop here. Okay, so we'll enter the 1,700. On line 17, we're going to enter the smaller of 16A or 16B. That's the 132. The earned income. Now the earned income is different from the adjusted gross income. If we go back to the 1040, remember the earned income up here is $59,000. So on line 18A, we'll enter $59,000. And then, let's see, on 19, is the amount on line 18A more than 2,500? So yes, subtract 2,500 from the amount on 18A. So if we subtract 2,500 from the 59,000, we get 56,500. We're going to multiply the amount on line 19 times 15%, and that'll give us $84.75. Okay, on line 16B is the amount 5,100 or more. So no, it's not. So skip part 2B and enter the smaller of line 17 or 20 on line 27. So we'll come down here and enter that 132 here, and then on line 28 of the form 1040. Okay, so we're getting another $132 as an additional child tax credit, and that is simply because this couple is considered lower income, so they are entitled to the additional refunding credit. So we'll bring that down to line 32, and then our total prepayments will be $21.32. So we have a tax liability of 0 and prepayments of $21.32. So this couple is going to get all $2,132 refunded. Now that we've finished this return, I do want to remind you that on your Chapter 7 tax return exam, you will have one more credit to calculate, and that's going to be the education credits on Form 8863. So make sure you watch the demonstration video on how to complete Form 8863 under the Chapter 7 module.